everybody. So today we're going to end our class basically with the end of life. We're going to talk about death and dying and about some afterlife beliefs. We're also going to talk about the grief process. I don't know, most of you have probably, though, lost somebody in your life. Maybe some of you have not. I knew somebody, my cousin actually had never been to her first funeral until she was about 19 years old. We had loss in our family. Our grandfather had died, but her mom had really shielded her from that. And so she had never gone to a funeral before until one of her friends had passed away when she was in junior college. So maybe that is your story. I don't know. I think everybody deals with death a little differently. Some people deal with death by avoiding it. Not avoiding death, but avoiding the subject. We also usually try to avoid death. But most of us, most people don't really like to talk about it. It seems really uncomfortable for a lot of people. And so today we're going to embrace the topic because honestly, I think it's something that's important to learn to talk about. When I was a little girl, my grandmother passed away when I was about 6 years old, 7, somewhere in there, I think 6. And I remember I became physically ill during the funeral. I did not know how to deal with all the emotions that went with that. I was having a hard time understanding what was going on, even though I had been brought up to believe like in heaven and things like that. But still, when it came down to it, at 6, I was pretty young and didn't understand completely. On the way home, we were up in Oregon for the funeral. On the way home, I remember my dad started talking to me about, and this might seem strange to some of you, and honestly, it does sound kind of strange, but honestly, it was probably pretty important that my dad did it this way. He started asking me, well, Michelle, if you were to die, who would you want to speak at your funeral? Would there be any songs that you would want to be at your funeral? And he started having me actually plan my funeral at age 6. Now, was that to really prepare for a funeral? No, it was instead to encourage me to learn how to talk about it. And honestly, as years went by, I became more and more comfortable with the subject of death. I will tell you the one area that I really still struggle with is the idea of suffering during death. I think that is that's a terrible way to go and a terrible thing to happen, and it's hard to be just on the watching end of that. I've watched several people that I love have to suffer at the end, and so those parts are always the difficult parts, I think. I think if you were to ask anybody, like, how do you want to go? Most people would say peacefully. Most people say probably peacefully in their sleep, so they're not having to know that it's time to go. Anyway, so let's get started, though. And again, I'm just going to warn you that some of this is going to feel uncomfortable, but I'm going to ask you to just hang in there with me because I'm going to try to make it the least uncomfortable as possible. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, let's start with the worst obituaries ever. Mary Ann Teresa Johnson Reddick, born January 4th, 1935, and died alone on August 30th, 2013. She is survived by her 6 of 8 children who spent her lifetime torturing in every way possible. While she neglected and abused her small children, she refused to allow anyone else to care or show compassion towards them. When they became adults, she stalked and tortured anyone they dared to love. Everyone she met, adult or child, was tortured by her cruelty and exposure to violence, criminal activity, and vulgarity and hatred of the gentle or kind of, I think this is kind of heart. Okay, so I'm just going to say I don't think Mary Ann was a very nice person. And her family kind of got their revenge by letting everybody know in her obituary what the truth was about her. Could you imagine reading this in a real newspaper? This is a real obituary. Let's look at the next one. Oh, nope, we continue. with poor Marianne, on behalf of her children, whom she so abrasively exposed to her evil and violent life. We celebrate her passing from this earth and hope she lives in the afterlife, reliving each gesture of violence, cruelty, and shame that she delivered on her children. Her surviving children will now live the rest of their lives with the peace of knowing their nightmare has finally had some sort of closure. Marianne was not a nice person, it sounds like. They're celebrating her death. I'm not sure if that's, I hope, hopefully none of us have that kind of life that people would celebrate them dying. Okay, let's go to the next one. Funniest obituary. William Freddie McAuliffe, Bloomingdale. The man, the myth, the legend. Men wanted to be him, and women wanted to be with him. William Freddie McAuliffe died on September 11th, 2013. Freddie loved deep fried Southern food, smothered in cane syrup, fishing at Santee Cooper Lake, Little Debbie cakes, 2.5 Men, beautiful women, Reese's Cups, and Jim Beam, not necessarily in that order. He hated vegetables and hypocrites, not necessarily in that order. Freddie sounded like a funny guy. He was a master craftsman who single-handedly built his beautiful house from the ground up. Freddie was also great at growing fruit trees, grilling chicken and ribs, popping wheelies on his Harley at 50 miles per hour, hopefully that's not what took him out, and making everyone feel appreciated and hitting Coke bottles at 30 yards with his .45. When it came to floor covering, Freddie was one of the best in business, and he loved doing it. Freddie had a really long obituary. I will tell you, if you paid for this in the newspaper, it would probably be about $500. Freddie loved to tell stories, and you could be sure 50% of every story was true. You just never knew which 50%. Marshall Matt Dillon, Ben Cartwright, and Charlie Harper were his TV heroes, and he was the hero for his 6 children, Mark, Shane, Clint, Brandis, Ashley, and Thomas. Freddie adored the ladies, and they adored him. There isn't enough space here to list all the women from Freddie's past. There isn't enough space in the Bloomingdale phone book. A few of the more colorful ones were Mama Margie, Crazy Pam, Big, I won't say that, Wanda, and Spacey Stacy, and Sweet Melissa. He explained that nickname had nothing to do with her attitude. He attracted more women than a shoe sales at Macy's. So, that is a lot of obituary for that guy. But the next thing we're going to do this week is we are going to write your own obituary. And so to help you with that, I thought we would watch this quick video and give you an idea of really what that looks like.
Most people never get to read their own obituary. It's hard to read when you're dead, right? But I got to read mine, and here's...
Oops. Let's start that over.
Most people never get to read their own obituary. It's hard to read when you're dead, right? But I got to read mine, and here's what it said. It said, Brad Meltzer, a versatile Brooklyn-born novelist who spun a childhood passion for comic books and a prosecutor's zeal for research into a string of best-selling thrillers, died yesterday at his home. He was 40 years old, right? So how'd I get to read my own obituary? A few years ago, I was working with a group that helped save the house where Superman, the character Superman, was created. And when a reporter for the Wall Street Journal was asking me about it, he said to me, you know, Brad, this is going to be in your obituary. My first thought was, thank you for so clearly contemplating my death, right? But it was a crazy question. What would be in my obituary? It haunted me. It haunted me so much that I called back the reporter a year later, and I said to him, I want to hire you for a project. I want you to write my obituary. And he did. You saw what it said, that I write thrillers, that I like research. What I also said, and I missed it when I first read it because it was in the body of the email, it said that he got called on to another story, and as a result, he didn't have time to actually finish my entire obituary. So as I scroll down to the bottom of my own obituary, which is really all I care about, it ends with this sentence, and I'm not making this up, just 3 words. He was a. Right? That's it. He was a. Cut off mid-sentence. It's a perfect metaphor, right? He was a. What was I? Was I good? Was I bad? Did I matter? Did I achieve greatness? What was I? And I know so many of you are now doing what I did in that moment. You're wondering what would be in your obituary. When you die, how will you be remembered? And that's what we're going to do here tonight. We're going to answer that question. How are you going to be remembered? But to answer it, I want you to have to figure out who's going to remember you. Because you figure out who will remember you, and you'll know how you're going to be remembered. But before we do that, let me challenge you. I want you to separate all the things that you do for yourself from the things you do for other people. First is what you do for yourself. Where you went to school, the degrees you got, your job title, those are all for you. And they will be in your obituary. But ironically, they'll be the first things forgotten. Your resume fades with you. Your job title, gone. And when you die, it'll be one of the last times that your resume is ever mentioned. But those things you do for other people, that's your legacy, right? And sometimes it's not even in your obituary, but it is what lasts. Because that's what legacy is, right? It's what endures. It's what your impact on other people is. It's what your effect is. It's what people remember about you. And as I thought about it, I realized there were 4 different types of categories of legacies that we all have. The first is your personal legacy. That's the category, your personal legacy. It's the impact you have on people in your personal life, like your friends. And as I thought about it, the person who had the biggest impact on me of that group was, without question, my 9th grade English teacher, Miss Spicer. Miss Spicer, when I was in 9th grade, okay, she came to me, she said, you know what, you can write. And I said, I don't know what you're talking about. She said, you can write, you're in the wrong class, you need to be in the honors class. And I didn't know what she meant. She tried to change my schedule. There was some kind of conflict. And she said to me, you know what, you're going to sit in this corner for the entire year. You're going to ignore everything I do at the blackboard. You're going to sit here and do the honors work. Ignore every homework assignment I give. Ignore everything I say. And what she was really saying to me was, you're going to thank me later. And sure enough, when my first novel came out, I went back to Miss Spicer's classroom. And I knocked on the door, and she said, can I help you? And she didn't know who I was. Last time she saw me, I had a full head of hair, right? God bless junior high. And when I walked in, I said, my name is Brad Meltzer. And this novel I wrote, it's for you. And she starts crying. And I said to her, why are you crying? She said, I was going to retire this year because I thought I wasn't having an impact anymore. I said, are you kidding me? You have 30 students. We have 1 teacher. And as I thought about this woman, the first person who ever told me I can write, she had no idea of her impact, no concept of her legacy, right? Even with something so important, sometimes we don't even know what our legacy is. We have no clue whatsoever. And it just shook me. And as I thought about it, I just was like, how is Miss Spicer do that? Because God knows what we leave behind if you don't know your own legacy. A few years ago, I was at my high school reunion. And this woman, who I remember is this really nice, sweet woman, comes up to me and she says, Brad Meltzer, you know what I remember about you? When we were playing ball one time, I dropped the ball and you yelled at me. And I had no memory of the story. I didn't doubt the story's the truthfulness of it. And I just felt about 2 inches tall because as the next 15 minutes, I sat there apologizing to this woman. And as I thought about those legacies right there, right, the impact that my teacher had on me, my impact on this woman, I realized the next category of legacy that we all have. And it's your family legacy. It's a legacy you have on your family members. For me, without a question, the number 1 person who has impacted my life was my mother, Terry Meltzer. My mom died a few years ago from breast cancer. But before she died, I was up at Borders headquarters, when Borders was still around, their headquarters in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And the head of sales for Borders said to me, Brad, guess where your books sell more than anywhere else? Straight sales, not even per capita. I said, I don't know, New York City, 8 million New Yorkers in one place. No. Washington, D.C., I write thrillers about the White House. No. The number 1 place where my book sold was the Boca Raton, Florida Borders, 1 mile from the furniture store where my mother used to work. That means my mother single-handedly beat 8 million New Yorkers, right? God bless her, right? That's awesome. But here's the crazy part. The crazy part is her legacy is that insane love she has for me, right? It is the foundation of all my confidence in everything I am. And when I think about it, that's really, now you know the first two categories of legacy. There's your family legacy and there's your personal legacy. But also about my mom, that story, it's not about selling books, right? It's about her love for me. And that story, it isn't even in her obituary. And I know because I wrote her obituary and I didn't put it in there. But again, what a legacy. Which brings me to the third category of legacy that you're all going to have. And that's the legacy you have on your community. Right now, in the New York City subway, there's a big poster up on some of the cars by a teaching organization. And the poster says, "Who will remember your name?" It's a potent question, right? When you die, who will remember your name? We talked about family, we talked about friends, and who else? Who will remember your name? Right now, in inner city Miami, there's a soul food restaurant named Jumbo's. And Jumbo's in the early 1960s, like almost every other restaurant down here, wouldn't hire black people. In fact, if you were black and you wanted to eat there, you couldn't go in the front door. You had to be served around the side. But when my father-in-law, Bobby Flam, who's here tonight, when he took over the restaurant in early 1968, he despised that rule. He said rules like that were for uncivilized times. And he quickly hired 3 black employees. I appreciate it. Trust me, he appreciates it a lot. So Jumbo's, he hired very quickly 3 black employees. And right after that, 30 of his white employees quit, walk out the door. He didn't care. He became one of the first restaurants in Miami to integrate. Jumbo's became a civil rights landmark, as it's been honored here for. That's an unbelievable story. You know what the best part is? It's still going strong, still open now. For 55 years it's been going. But here's my favorite part of it, is that years later, when there were race riots in Liberty City, and so many storefronts were burned, and the stores were devastated and destroyed, nobody touched Jumbo's. And you want to know why? Because everyone knew Jumbo's name. For all those years, Jumbo's looked out for its community, and as a result, the community looked out for it. And sometimes, make no mistake, it can take you a lifetime, a whole lifetime, to impact a whole community. But if you are lucky enough to impact your entire community, that appreciation will always come back, always. And again, it's a story almost no one knows. But also, again, what a legacy. Which brings me to the final place that'll feel your legacy. It's the legacy you have on complete strangers. Okay, a few years ago, I found out about a police officer named Officer Frank Shankwitz, who found out about a boy with leukemia who also wanted to be a police officer. So Shankwitz had a little motorcycle riding course made for the boy. He got him a little toy motorcycle. They had this great, beautiful day together. And the boy goes into a coma. So Police Officer Shankwitz goes to the boy's hospital room to pin little motorcycle wings onto the boy. And as he pins the wings on the boy, this is a true story, the boy wakes up out of his coma and smiles. He then goes back into his coma. The boy later dies. But on the way back from the funeral, Police Officer Shankwitz looks at his buddy and he says, "You know, we made that kid really happy for just one day. We should do that for other kids." And that's how the Make-A-Wish Foundation was born, right? By one person sharing their good idea with another. You know what the best part of that story is? We all have some Frank Shankwitz in us. We do. For some of you, it happens when you donate money to a charity. For others, it's when you do some community service, like with one of my favorite organizations here, City Year. Or maybe it happens when you give bring canned goods or toys to your church, or when you do a charity run. We will all have legacies where we have no idea who we're helping, but you are helping them. That's your legacy. And so now you know the 4 categories of legacy, right? There's the effect you have on your friends, on your family, on your community, and on complete strangers. That's the first answer I promised you tonight. That's who will remember you. But now let's tackle the more vital question. How are you going to be remembered? And that's the tricky thing about legacies. We will all have them. Good or bad, you will have a legacy. The only question is, what kind of legacy do you want? It's like when you're little, people used to say to you, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" But the far more important question is, what do you want to be forever? And with that in mind, I want you to think about your own obituary. Think right now, what's going to be in your obituary? And more important, what do you want in your obituary? Because that's the key question, right? We all want these so-called great obituaries, but how do we get there? And here's the number one most important thing I'm going to say to you tonight. It is all within your power. Think of that story I told you about my 9th grade English teacher. Think of Miss Spicer. Or better yet, think of your own Miss Spicer. Think of the first person who told you you were good at something. Think of the role they played in your life. You are now that person. Your teacher, a camp counselor, a mentor. Those people were giants in your life, right? That is you now. And your words, encouraging words, it puts you on the mountaintop. You're on the mountaintop every single day, and your words to a family member, to a friend, to a complete stranger, those words are your power. Good job. I like what you did here. You have a real talent for that. Those words are power, and they're your power. And if you don't use them, time fades and your power fades with them. But here's the best part of it. All of us can use that power. You don't have to start the Make-A-Wish Foundation to change the world. All you have to do is help one person. Be kind to one person. That's the answer. It is my core belief. It is in every story I told you here tonight. I believe ordinary people change the world. I don't care where you went to school. I don't care how much money you make. That is nonsense to me. I believe in regular people and their ability to affect change in this world. I believe in my mother and my English teacher and a soul food restaurant named Jumbo's and a cop with a toy motorcycle. And it's why I believe in the very first hero that we talked about tonight. You know why I worked to save the house where Superman was created? Because to me, the most important part of the story isn't Superman. The most important part of the story is Clark Kent. And you want to know why? Because we're all Clark Kent. We all know what it's like to be boring and ordinary and wish we could do something incredibly beyond ourselves. But here's the real news. We all can do something incredibly beyond ourselves. And I'm going to tell you how, because I'm not just here to tell you some nice stories and save the world with a smile. I want you to think right now of that first person who told you you were good at something. Think of that teacher, that mentor. Think of the person who gave you your first real job in your life. Think of someone who helped you. And I want you to thank them. That's it. That's all I ask. When I stop talking, when you leave here, call them, email them, find them on Facebook. I don't care how, but find them and say thank you. Last summer, I found out that my 9th grade English teacher, Miss Spicer, was finally retiring. She lasted and kept teaching over 12 years since I first went back to visit her. You better believe I was at that retirement party. That woman changed my life. She deserved my thank you. And that woman was a giant in my life. And by going and saying thank you to her, I became a giant in hers. You are on the mountaintop every single day. Use your power. Go say thank you. I promise you will never believe what will grow from it. And with that said, I want to tell you about my favorite obituary of all time. And it's my favorite because it doesn't just tell you the factoids of someone's life. It tells you his legacy. It's the obituary of a man named Susumu Yamaguchi. Mr. Yamaguchi was a Japanese businessman. He was on a business trip in Japan. And it was August 6, 1945. And he was on a business trip to, of all places, Hiroshima. And the first atomic bomb falls from the sky. It goes off, and he survives. He's burned across his body. He looks around. He sees the devastation. He knows the city can't handle it. So he goes to his hometown, to a place called Nagasaki. And the second atomic bomb hits. And he survives that too. To this day, he is the only person the Japanese government officially recognizes as surviving both the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And you know what he spends the rest of his life doing? Now think of this a moment, right? I live here in Miami. We're the bitching and moaning capital of the world, right? If that happened here, we'd be like, I'm sitting in Hiroshima, and all of a sudden the bomb hits. I go to Nagasaki, my neck, my back. We'd be bitching and moaning about it forever, right? Don't clap for that. That's awful. That's the bad part of Miami, right? But it's true. That's what we do. But you know what Mr. Yamaguchi spends the rest of his life doing? Think about it a moment, okay? He spends the rest of his life talking about peace and the dangers of nuclear armaments. He says the good part of what happened to him is that he gets to tell his story. He says his life is like a baton. And every time the story is passed, all those batons come together and they form a raft for others. A raft to help and carry other people. That's a life, but that's a legacy. As for my obituary, he was you know what? That's perfect. Because no matter what anyone writes about me or any of you, no one will ever capture the most important parts of who we are. So our obituaries will say whatever they will say. And that's the answer. You don't get to write your own obituary. What you get to do is live your life. And that's okay because in there is your power. and you do good, you help others, you go say thank you, you will not just live a better life, you will live forever. Thank you very much.
So my question for you is, what do you want your legacy to be? What do you want your personal legacy to be? What do you want your community legacy to be? Here's what we know and what Mr. Meltzer told you through his TED Talk, that, most of you are really at the beginning of your adulthood. Some of you are maybe a little farther in, but most of you are at the beginning. And so right now is the time you get to really start to live your legacy. We have no idea how long we'll be here on this earth, right? I might get hit by a bus tomorrow, or I could live to be 112. But I want to live the best day every day and be the best me I can be. So you do have this assignment to write your obituary, right? So what is an obituary? Well, your answer will no doubt include the word death in it. And death might even be that one word which attempts to control your thinking and steer you towards the potentially gloomy side of this assignment. However, nothing should be further from your thinking than the idea of death. An obituary is actually written acknowledgement of a person's life, not death. So plain and simple, this assignment is about life, the life not yet lived, the life you want to dream about living. And so when you go back to this module and you look at the assignment, that's the perspective I want you to look at. What is the legacy that you want to leave behind? And write about that, okay? So you get to use some creativity, you get to make some stuff up, but don't make it up just, I want to be king of England or something. I want you to be realistic. But what is your dream about the future? How do you want to affect others? Okay, let's move on from obituaries to actually death. So what is the causes of death? Well, this has changed over history as life expectancy has actually increased. In 1900s, the average lifespan was 47.5 years. Well, I'm going to be 48 next month, so that means that I've outlived most people around me because I am a few months ahead of the curve. The leading cause of death at that point, pneumonia, TB, tuberculosis, diarrhea, heart disease, stroke, liver disease, injuries, cancer, senility, and diphtheria. Honestly, I've never heard anybody having diphtheria at this point. I think we've kind of eradicated that illness for the most part. Maybe in third world countries, I'm not sure. In the 2000s, the average lifespan was much higher, ahead to 76.5 years. The leading causes of death at this point, heart disease, cancer, stroke, chronic lung disease, pneumonia is still in there, accidents, diabetes, we've added one, suicide, kidney disease, and chronic liver disease. There's something called the cellular clock theory. It basically states that cells have a limited number of times they can replicate themselves. The Hayflick limit says the limit is 50 times, basically, that it can replicate. As I don't know if you know this, but it's something that's pretty well known. Our body, our cells, pretty much replace themselves every 7 years. And so at some point, though, do we run out of cells, or can they not replicate themselves? That's cellular clock theory. That's what that says. We do have what's called telomeres. So with each replication, the telomeres becomes slightly shorter, eventually becoming too short to replicate any further. The telomeres is the end of the cell, and so each time it does get shorter. I want to tell you a quick story that's kind of an example of telomeres. I had a friend who her husband was probably about 49 years old, and he started having a lot of pain in his hips. And he goes to the doctor, and the doctor basically says, you have kind of a strange condition for your age, but basically the what do you call it? I can't think. Anyway, something in his hip is the cartilage has basically disintegrated. So you're just basically rubbing bone on bone. You need a hip replacement. Now, here's the problem with having a hip replacement at 50 years old. I learned a lot about hip replacements during my friend's process. When they actually replace the hip, of course, they cut the bone at the top of the thigh. They drill a hole. They actually cut a little bit of the bone off. They drill a hole down into the thigh bone where they put a rod. It's usually a titanium rod. And then that's what the hip replacement goes on top of that. And then eventually the bone kind of attaches itself to that hip replacement and you go on. Here's the thing though with hip replacements and most joint replacements. They don't last a lifetime. They only last about 10 years. And so, and the most that they want to do in a lifetime are 2. They only want to do 2 hip replacements. So if you do a hip replacement at 50, and then you wait 10 years and you do another hip replacement at 60, well, what happens when you're 70? Because hopefully you have a lot longer to live, right? And so they had some concerns, but again, the pain kind of outweighed the concerns, and so they went ahead and did a hip replacement. One other reason that they don't want to do more than 2 is because when they drill down into that, it makes your bone shorter, and they can only do that twice. So it's kind of the same idea as the telomeres, is that it can only go so many times. You can only cut it so many times. It can only replace itself so many times. By the way, telomeres, guess what? That is not your word of the week. I, for some reason, thought it was. It was not. Okay. Free radical theory is another theory on aging. Unstable molecules that contain an unpaired electron. So they cause damage to the DNA and other structures believed to contribute to many fatal diseases like cancer, heart disease, and Alzheimer's. The question is there a prevention? Well, some think that antioxidants help absorb the extra electrons. So therefore, people take their antioxidants, whether it's vitamin C or drinking your orange juice or eating oranges. But that is the free radical theory. Okay, here's the next question. Where do we die? Home versus hospital. So many of you probably hope to someday, actually, let me go back to that. Most of you probably hope that you, again, die at home, in the comfort of your home with family around, or maybe in your sleep where it's nobody around, but you don't know you're going to die, you just go. But a lot of people, if they know that they are coming to the end of their life, many of them don't want to be in a hospital. Some of them want to be home. Nowadays, though, we have what's called hospice care. What is hospice? Well, it is. Its focus is on what's called palliative care, which palliative care is to help make a person comfortable as they go to the end of their life. Basically, there is no treatment that is given to help a person. It is literally just for comfort measures. The care team that's usually involved in hospice includes medical people like nurses. I might have counselors, there might be volunteers that come in and help. There's sometimes psychological and spiritual counseling that takes place. Sometimes hospice even has housekeeping and relief. Relief being almost like, I'm going to say like a babysitter, except for it's somebody to come in and just give the caregivers a break, so they can maybe just go out for a little while, because it is exhausting taking care of somebody who is near death. And then, of course, they do have bereavement aftercare. They actually hospice often has what they call grief share programs, which is group therapy for after you lose somebody. But let's watch this quick video about palliative care versus hospice.
Palliative care and hospice are similar in that they both offer medical support for people with serious, sometimes terminal illnesses, but the two have very different objectives.
Patients, families, even our medical professionals are still confused about the role of palliative care in a patient with serious illnesses.
Dr. Sharika Newman is part of the palliative care team at Lee Memorial Health System.
Palliative medicine actually runs concurrent with a patient's medical illness, even when they are in curative phases, such as chemotherapy, radiation therapy, being treated for their heart failure or chronic lung disease.
There's a key distinction that sets it apart from hospice.
Hospice is end-of-life care, meaning the patient can no longer benefit from curative measures, or they have failed curative measures and they're truly at end of life and only need the supportive care for end of life.
Palliative care is frequently directed towards cancer, heart conditions, and stroke, but any illness that's long-term and debilitating can fall under its umbrella. Taking a team approach, both palliative care and hospice include doctors, nurses, social workers, even clergy. Points of interest range from pain management to helping a patient cope with the consequences of their condition.
We're focusing on quality of life and not isolating the patient into just focusing on the medical disease. And I think that as the baby boomers age, and they are an intellectually aging group, they're going to want these types of supportive cares.
Its focus on quality of life, not end of life, sets palliative care apart. For Lee Memorial Health System, I'm Amy Osher.
Other decisions about death that sometimes we have to look at. Euthanasia. This is something that has made headlines more in the last 5 to 10 years as it's becoming more legal in different states. I believe, I'm not sure, I think it's legal in California now. But it's basically somebody voluntarily ending their life with usually the help of a physician. They give them the right kind of medication. There is a passive way, which is basically seeing medical intervention to prolong life, versus an active way, taking steps to hasten a death, so assisted suicide. Again, hospice is usually very passive. It is not active. It is just ceasing all medical intervention. When my grandmother was 90, almost 97, she had a stroke, and it was very debilitating. And she had made a decision before this that she did not want to have basically life-sustaining interventions done. And so she went into hospice, and hospice actually came to her home. They brought a hospital bed in. They had somebody come in daily and help and do things like bathe her and change her sheets and things like that. The family took care of her the rest of the time. But one thing that was told is number one, she really had no way of eating or drinking, but that was the fastest way that she would be able to go. If you don't drink, you only live for about 4 to 5 days. And so that was what happened. She lived about 4 days after coming home, and with no IVs and no fluids, and her end of life actually was pretty peaceful. I said that she had made decisions beforehand. And sometimes, especially as people get older, that's something that they really do look at doing. They make living wills. They make what's called advance directives. Advance directives will tell a family or a doctor of what their wishes are. Do they want to be resuscitated? Do they not want to be resuscitated? Again, I know that's sometimes really hard for a family to understand if the person has given those wishes to somebody, but they didn't have a say in it. And so that's the one thing that can be very difficult, but it's also, you have to remember, this is the person's wishes. This is how they want to go, to have a do not resuscitate order. A lot of times if you go into the hospital, that's one thing. A social worker will come in, even if you're there just to have a baby, they will come in and ask you, do you want, do you want to have this signed or do you not want it signed? So it's just having an understanding. Some people choose to do this like a living will, especially, let's say the scenario that was given to me was, there's a mom or a dad who is older. Maybe their spouse is either a step parent or maybe it's a spouse that maybe their spouse has died. This is just them, but they have several kids. And instead of having the kids disagree and argue, they basically want to make the decision and take that off the kids' shoulders and help, just help in that process when that time comes. Okay, we're going to talk about grief, but we're going to talk about this in our next slideshow, so join me then.